This video is part 1 of 4 on Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. Coming up. Hey there, welcome to Equipped. I'm Mario Escobedo. This channel is for people who want to deepen their understanding of God's Word for their own spiritual growth and also because they want to share it with others more effectively. If you haven't done it yet, consider subscribing to this channel so that you're always notified of new teachings as they become available. So in this teaching, I'm doing Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12, but this is part 1. I'm going to divide it up into four teachings, 4 different videos. Now, I did a video on an introduction to the book of Joel. If you haven't seen that yet, I recommend that you watch that video before diving into this video on Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. Let me show you what I'm doing and why I'm saying that this is part 1 of 4 on Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. So this is the passage, this whole passage right here, Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. Now, the way I describe a passage is a group of verses that develop a main idea, a big idea. But when I study a passage, it's a lot easier for me and a lot more beneficial for me to divide the passage up into individual paragraphs or sections. And so I study passages paragraph by paragraph, and then at the end, I put it all together to come out with what I think is the main idea of that passage. So what I'm doing in this teaching on Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12 is I'm doing separate videos per paragraph. So this video that you're watching right now is on this paragraph right here, this section right here. The next video will be for this paragraph, and then so forth and so on. And then at the end, I'll do one concluding video that summarizes and pulls everything together for this entire passage of Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to dive in to the first paragraph of this larger passage, which is Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 4. So if you can take out your Bible, it's probably going to be the best way for you to join me on this study so that we can see this together. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at this part first, okay? And even though I'm not doing a whole lot with verse 1, I do want to point something out in verse 1. Verse 1 serves as the introduction for the book, of course, but the only thing I really want to point out in verse 1 is the name of Joel, the prophet. His name is actually 2 Hebrew words combined to form his name. And we could divide his name right here. Those are 2 separate Hebrew words. The first part of his name comes from the word or the name Yahweh, which is the name of the God of Israel. The second part of his name comes from the word El, and that is just a general term, a general word for God, any God in general. But when you combine them, what Joel's name means is Yahweh, that is the God of Israel. Yahweh is God. That's an incredible statement just right at the beginning of the book, just in his name itself. So let's go down now to the first paragraph. Again, we're looking at the entire passage in this 4-part series, but in this video, we're just looking at the first paragraph, verses 2 through 4. So let's start reading, and then I'm going to point some things out as we're going along. Here's what Joel says. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. So he's calling everybody to listen. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. Now, I want us to stop right there. And for a second, I want you to pretend that you've never read the book of Joel before and that you have no idea that he's talking about a locust plague or a locust invasion. I want you to approach this as if you're reading this prophecy for the very first time. And here's why. When Joel begins this prophecy and he says something like, has anything like this ever happened? You know, we don't know if he's talking about something good or something bad. It could be something good that he's talking about. We have no idea. So far, Joel has given no indication that he's talking about something bad. And then furthermore, in verse 3, when it says, tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation, we still don't know if we're talking about something bad. What we know is that we're talking about something unprecedented. I mean, something that has never happened before, something so unique, something so big that it demands the attention of future generations, but we don't know if it's something bad. And in fact, this here in Joel, this isn't the first time that the people of Israel are commanded or instructed to tell their children and successive generations about something that takes place. Typically, it's about something good. So for example, in Exodus chapter 12, verses 24 through 27, God instructs the people of Israel to tell the successive generations, beginning with their children, about the Passover and what God did during the Passover. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, the section that we know as the Shema, God tells the people of Israel to tell their children about God's commands. So the idea about telling successive generations about something big happening, it's not new, and Joel isn't the first one to do it. And again, typically it relates to good stuff. So far in verses 2 and 3, we don't have an idea if Joel is talking about something good or something bad. We just know he's talking about something huge, something big, something unprecedented. And I would argue that Joel is kind of setting the people up, that he's making it seem as if he's going to say something good, because the people of Israel, anytime they hear stuff like this, has anything like this ever happened? Tell it to your children. You know, they kind of expect something good to follow. So we go on to verse 4. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. And what the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. All right, so in verse 4, we discover that definitely Joel is not talking about something good. He's talking about a locust invasion that had come to the people of Judah, to the people of God. Now, this was big. This was a devastating locust invasion, so big that Joel says, has anything like this ever happened in your days or even in the days of your ancestors? And this is so big that you're going to tell it to your children, to their children, and to the children of the next generation. So we could say that 5 generations of Israelites, something like that, had never seen something like this. This locust plague is something that would happen only once every 150 years or so. Let's say it that way. This is how big this locust plague was. This is how devastating it was. And in fact, in verse 4, the way Joel describes what happened when the locust plague came definitely describes that this was devastating, because whatever this locust left, well, this locust got to it. Whatever this locust left, well, then this group of locusts got to it. Whatever they left, well, then these other locusts got to it. So we're talking about a pretty devastating situation and invasion that happened here. Now, let me mention to you something really quickly here. You'll notice that there are 4, let me see, the locust swarm, the great locusts, the young locusts, and the other locusts. 4 categories, 4 mentions of locusts. And in the original language, in the Hebrew, these are 4 different words used to describe locusts. And different scholars have proposed different suggestions as to why Joel uses 4 different words. So some scholars have suggested that what Joel is doing here is that he's talking about 4 different species of locusts. That's why he uses 4 different words. Okay, that's one option. Other scholars have suggested that these are 4 different stages of development of the locust. All right, let me see if I can spell development. 4 different stages of development. So the larva, the pupa, and then the pupa. I said pupa. The pupa. 4 different stages of development of the locust. Okay, that's another possibility. Others have said that this is 4. What should we call it? 4 waves, or 4 different swarms of locusts that happen one right after the other, and this is what made it so devastating. And what we should note about these different options that are listed here is that we can't say with certainty which of these are correct. One of them has to be correct, I suppose, but we can't say with certainty which one is correct. Definitely what's taking place here is that I'm going to add one more option, which I think works with any of these options, is that this is a rhetorical device that Joel is using. What do we mean by that? When we say Joel is using this as a rhetorical device, we're saying that he's using these successive phrases of locusts to emphasize the devastation. To talk about how great the devastation was, he lists it out as 4 different types of locusts, stages of development, waves or swarms, whatever it is. He's using this as a rhetorical device to emphasize just how devastating this locust plague was. Now, it bears mentioning at this point right here that locust plagues, or locust invasions, were not uncommon in the ancient Near East. It wasn't as if this was the only time it happened. However, the way Joel words things, we discover that this was a pretty unprecedented type of locust invasion. This was massive as compared to any other kind of locust invasion that these people of Joel's generation had witnessed. And that's important to note. Now, what I want to point out here is that even though Joel doesn't say it, I think he is saying it without saying it, that this locust invasion is coming directly from God. That this isn't just some sort of natural phenomenon. This isn't some sort of natural devastation that took place because this kind of stuff just happens. I think Joel is being very specific in his choice of words because he's letting the people of Israel know this comes from God. Now, why do I say that? Well, because there's really only one other time in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, where a devastating locust plague is mentioned. And that's, let's go to our Bible over here. That is in Exodus chapter 10, verse 13 and 14. This is the locust plague that was part of the 10 plagues that God sent to the people of Egypt. I'm going to read verses 13 and 14. Here's what happened. Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. So I think we can say this with a certain degree of certainty, a fair degree of certainty, that when the people that Joel was talking to would have heard about this locust plague and how unprecedented it was, I think in their minds, they would have gone back to the locust plague of Egypt and said, wait a minute, if God caused that locust plague, then it's a pretty good bet that he caused this locust plague as well. And there's another verse in the Bible that leads me to believe that Joel was definitely saying, and that the people would have understood, that God was the originator of this locust plague. For that, we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, we have the blessings for obedience, but we also have the curses for disobedience. So this is where Moses is talking to the people of Israel and letting them know the great stuff that will happen if they obey God. But then he also tells them of the dire consequences that will take place if they do not obey God. And so if we jump down to verse 38, here's what we read. This is one of the consequences, one of the curses that will happen. You will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little. Why? Because locusts will devour it. Let's go back to our passage. Let's go back to Joel. He's talking about this unprecedented, never before seen in these generations type of locust plague that happens. I just have to believe that the people of Israel, and definitely Joel, is telling the people, we need to wake up. You need to wake up because we've never seen anything like this happen before. And we're talking about locusts, people. We're not talking about just anything. We're talking about locusts. And you know what locusts mean. Remember the Exodus from Egypt. Remember the plagues. And remember the curses that God said would come upon the people of Israel if we didn't obey. I think Joel is calling the people's attention and telling them, we need to wake up. And he's going to say that a little bit further along in this passage. We need to realize that this isn't some casual event that's taking place, that this isn't coincidental, this isn't some other natural phenomenon that we should be accustomed to. God is speaking to us. Listen up, elders, everyone in the land. This has never happened before. We need to tell every generation that we come in contact with, we need to tell them about it, because these are locusts. You know what locusts mean. It's bad. This is coming from God as punishment for something we did. And he's going to elaborate on that later on in these verses and in his book as a whole. But I think Joel, without saying it, he's saying something that the people that he's addressing would definitely have captured. This is coming from God. Now, the last thing I want to do in this teaching is that I want to point out what I feel is the main idea of this particular paragraph. Now, this is something I do anytime I study a passage of scripture. As I go paragraph by paragraph, I identify what I think is the main idea of each paragraph. Now, the way I do it is that I use only the words of the biblical text to identify what I feel is the main idea of each paragraph. And right now we're just limited to this paragraph here. And so here's what I've selected. Here's what I feel is the main idea of this paragraph. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? In my mind, that right there, that question really summarizes what is taking place in this paragraph right here. So if somebody were to ask me, hey Mario, in your opinion, What is Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 about? I would point to them right here. You know, it's about this devastating event that Joel is pointing out to the people that had really never really happened before in their lifetime. To me, that is the main idea of this paragraph right here, main idea. And I typically highlight it in blue, that Joel is pointing this out to the people. Something like this has never happened before. We better pay attention to what's taking place because this is big. All right, so I'm gonna invite you to go back and read Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12 and take into consideration what I've presented to you here. Focus on those verses and see what you come up with. And I'd love to hear in the comments what you have to say about these verses and about Joel in general. Now, from here, I'm gonna invite you to go on to the next teaching in this series, which is Joel chapter 1 verses 5 through 8. That's the next teaching in this series. Thank you very much for joining me. God bless.